The morning the cattle started refusing water from the creek, Mabel Hooper didn't think much of it. Animals got strange notions sometimes. You couldn't read into every little thing, not out here where the land itself seemed to breathe its own peculiar moods. She stood at the fence line and watched the 3 steers wade into their knees, lower their heads, then lift them again without drinking. One by one they backed out onto the bank and stood there looking east, the way horses sometimes looked before a storm. She told herself it was nothing, but she noted it. That was the kind of woman Mabel was, the kind who noted things, filed them somewhere quiet in the back of her mind, and kept moving. She was 28 years old and had been living on the Hooper homestead since she married Warren 3 years prior. The land sat in a broad valley in eastern Montana, 47 acres of it, bordered to the north by a ridge of scrub pine, and to the south by the creek that in good years ran clear and in bad years ran the color of weak tea. Warren had inherited the place from his father. His mother, Agnes, had come with it. Agnes Hooper had opinions about most things, and she had firm opinions about Mabel. The opinions were not flattering. Too soft in the middle, Agnes had said to her neighbor Edna Birch the first winter, not bothering to lower her voice. A woman, that shape doesn't last out here. The land takes you or it doesn't, and it can smell weakness. Mabel had been carrying a pot of bean soup from the stove to the table when she heard it. She set the pot down. She served the soup. She did not say anything, because she had learned early that Agnes Hooper was a woman who fed on argument the way other people fed on bread, and there was no point giving her what she wanted. But she heard it, she filed it, and she kept moving. Warren was a decent man in most respects. He worked hard, didn't drink more than a glass of rye on Friday evenings, and had a gentleness with animals that she'd admired when she first met him at the church social in Miles City. He was also the kind of man who had learned, after 34 years, that it was simply easier to agree with Agnes than to do otherwise. Not from cruelty, more from habit. The way you learn not to lean on a gate that swings crooked, you just stop leaning. So when Agnes said Mabel was soft, Warren was quiet. And when Agnes said Mabel spent too much time wandering the creek banks instead of keeping a proper garden, Warren was quiet about that too. The truth was that Mabel had tried the garden. She'd put in beans and squash and 2 long rows of carrots the first spring. Agnes had supervised from the porch, pointing out everything she was doing wrong, and by July the garden had produced enough to fill 1.5 bushels before the grasshoppers found it. The second spring she'd done better, but a late frost killed the starts and she'd had to replant, and what came up was scraggly and behind. The third spring, this spring, she'd decided to do something different. She didn't announce it. She didn't ask permission or advice. She simply started walking the creek banks and the fence lines and the low ground near the old stock pond, looking at what was already growing there without anyone's help. She had learned this from her grandmother Pearl, who had lived her whole life in the hill country of western Arkansas, and who had known the name of every plant that grew within 10 miles of her cabin. Pearl had been dead for 6 years, but Mabel still heard her sometimes when she crouched down to look at something low to the ground. "That one's lamb's quarters, baby girl. Tastes like spinach if you get 'em young. And that one there, that's purslane. More good fat in those little leaves than in half a pound of meat." Mabel had spent her childhood summers on Pearl's land. She knew things most women her age didn't know, things that had skipped a generation the way certain facial features did, turning up unexpected, from a distance, in the face of someone who reminded you of someone else. She found lamb's quarters growing thick along the north fence. She found cattail shoots at the edge of the stock pond, still tender enough to eat raw. She found wood sorrel in the shade of the scrub pines and a long straggling patch of miner's lettuce near where the creek bent east. She found burdock, the big rough leaves of it, and the roots, which took some digging, but which her grandmother had cooked down with a little salt pork and called one of the finest things God put on the earth. She started bringing things home. The first time she set a bowl of cooked lamb's quarters on the table, Warren looked at it the way you might look at something you'd found in your boot. "What is that?" said. "Greens," she said. "What kind of greens? The kind that grow?" Agnes, across the table, made a sound in her throat that was not quite a laugh, and not quite a scoff, but somewhere in between. "She's feeding us weeds," Agnes said to Warren, as though Mabel were not in the room. "Your wife is feeding us weeds off the ground." "They're not weeds," Mabel said. Her voice was even. She was used to keeping it even. "What would you call them?" "Food," Mabel said. "I'd call them food." Warren ate a few bites. He didn't say they were bad. He didn't say much of anything. Agnes did not touch hers. This went on through May. Mabel kept bringing things in, cattail pollen, which she used like flour in a flat bread that turned out golden and faintly sweet. Young burdock root sliced thin and fried in a little lard. Purslane wilted in the pan with a bit of vinegar and a pinch of salt. Warren ate most of it quietly. Agnes refused most of it loudly and made herself cornmeal mush instead. Their neighbor Frank Sutter came by in the second week of May with a new seed catalog and the news that the Gillespie farm 2 valleys over had put in the biggest kitchen garden in the county. Near 3 acres of it, fenced and irrigated, and old Tom Gillespie had been to the county seat to purchase some new chemical fertilizer the salesman there swore would double their yield. "That's the future right there," Frank said, standing in the yard and looking pleased with information. Frank Sutter was the kind of man who enjoyed being the first to bring news of the future. "Science, Warren. You got to move with the times." Warren nodded, looking at the catalog. Mabel stood at the garden fence and looked at the land. She didn't say what she was thinking, which was that the creek level had been low since March, lower than she'd seen it, and that the spring had been dry, and the sky had a particular white quality to it that she didn't like. She was thinking about how Pearl used to say that the land told you what it needed if you stood still long enough to listen. She was also thinking about those cattle at the water's edge. June came in hot. Not regular Montana hot, the kind of hot that sits on the land like something pressing down with its whole weight. The sky was cloudless for 3 weeks straight. The creek dropped another foot. Warren drove into Harlow to get ice and came back with the information that the whole county was in the same condition, that the Gillespie garden was having to be watered twice a day, or the leaves crisped at the edges. Mabel went out to the creek bank and found that her lamb's quarters were doing just fine. Purslane, too, it was a plant that loved heat, loved drought, practically thrived on neglect. The cattails at the pond edge were going to seed, which was later than usual, but they were there. The burdock was enormous. Warren started a proper kitchen garden in the lower field. Agnes had been after him about it for months, saying they couldn't survive on what Mabel pulled out of the weeds, that a homestead needed a real garden, rows of it, the way his father had kept. Warren worked it for 2 weeks, turning soil, laying out rows, putting in late starts of squash and beans and a long section of turnips. In the first week of July, the grasshoppers came. They came from the east in a cloud that, from a distance, looked like weather, a dark smear low on the horizon that Mabel first saw when she walked out before breakfast. She stood at the fence and watched it and felt something drop in her chest. She'd heard stories. Her grandmother had told her about the summer of 1890 when the hoppers had stripped a farm in 3 hours flat, ate the laundry off the line, ate the wooden handles of tools for the salt in the sweat. She went to the creek bank. She started cutting. She cut lamb's quarters by the armload and carried them to the porch. She dug burdock root with the mattock, filling the big tin tub. She stripped cattail heads and put them in baskets. She worked for 3 hours, and by the time Warren came to find her, his face had a particular look, the look of a man who has already seen something bad and is working on believing it. "They're hitting the south field," he said. "I know," she said. "The garden." "I know," she said. He stood there watching her work. After a moment, he picked up a basket and started helping without being asked. That was the best thing Warren did that morning. He just picked up the basket. The grasshoppers spent 2 days on their land. They ate the kitchen garden down to bare dirt. They ate what was left of the hay in the near field. They took the tops off the wild grasses in the low ground and stripped the leaves from the young box elders along the fence line. They did not eat the lamb's quarters. They did not eat the burdock. They did not touch the cattails in the pond. They moved right past the purslane like it wasn't there. Mabel had read about this, or rather Pearl had told her, which was the same as reading in her mind. Some plants had their own defenses. Burdock was too bitter. Lamb's quarters had a slight mineral taste, a little like dust, that grasshoppers didn't favor. The native plants, the ones that had been here long before anyone put a fence around anything, had learned, over centuries, how to survive what the land sent at them. They had been surviving long before the Gillespies bought their chemical fertilizer. Frank Sutter came by 3 days later, looking like a man who had been struck by something, and was still working out what it was. His kitchen garden was gone. The Gillespies' 3 acres were gone, the whole thing down to nothing, and Tom Gillespie had driven to Harlow and sat in the feed store for an hour without saying much to anyone. "Bad year," Frank said, standing in the yard. "Yes," Warren said. Frank looked at the porch, where Mabel had 4 bundles of dried lamb's quarters hanging from the rafters and a row of cleaned burdock root laid out on the shelf to dry further. He looked at the big pot on the stove, from which something smelled the way a thing smells when it has been cooking with patience and good sense. "What's she got on the stove?" Frank asked. "Supper," Warren said. Frank stayed for supper. He ate 2 bowls of the burdock and lamb's quarters stew without saying much, and when he left he had the look of a man who had revised something in his mind, but was not yet ready to say so out loud. Agnes that evening sat down at the table and ate without commentary for the first time since Mabel had come to live there. It was not an apology. Mabel didn't expect one, but she noticed it the way she noticed everything, quietly, and with a certain private knowledge that sat in her chest like a warm coal. The dry spell broke in August, not with rain so much as with a slow series of gray days and a change in the quality of the air, the way a fever breaks, gradual, almost unnoticeable until you looked back and realized the worst had passed. By September there was real rain, and by October the creek was back to a reasonable level. That fall, Frank Sutter's wife Cora came by one afternoon and stood at the door and asked Mabel, with some awkwardness, if she might show her how to find and prepare some of the things she'd been gathering. Mabel made them coffee first, then she took her coat and her basket and walked Cora down to the creek bank and spent 2 hours showing her what grew there and what it was called and what it tasted like and how to prepare it. She showed her lamb's quarters and purslane and cattail shoots. She showed her the wood sorrel and explained about the oxalic acid, how you wanted to eat it in moderation, how it was fine in small amounts and had a lovely lemony taste that was especially good with fish. She showed her the burdock and dug a root to demonstrate the depth of it, and the way you had to peel it carefully and slice it thin. Cora listened carefully and wrote some things down in a small notebook she'd brought. On the way back to the house, Cora said, "I didn't know any of this was out here." "It's always been out here," Mabel said. "How did you learn it?" "My grandmother," Mabel said. "She learned it from her grandmother. It goes back a long way." She didn't say what she was also thinking, which was that it went back farther than any of their grandmothers, that the land itself had been holding this knowledge in its roots and stems and low trailing leaves for longer than anyone's family had been in this country, that all you had to do was be still enough and humble enough to receive it. She didn't say that, but she thought it, standing at the fence gate in the October light, with the creek running cold and clean behind her, and the lamb's quarters going to seed along the fence line in 1,000 small white clusters, already preparing for next year. Warren found her there after Cora had gone. He stood beside her for a while without speaking. This was something he did sometimes, came and stood beside her without needing anything to happen, and it was one of the things she'd always liked about him, even in the difficult years. "Frank told me you kept us fed this summer," he said finally. "We kept ourselves fed," she said. "He said the Gillespies lost near everything. Said Tom's been talking about selling." "I heard that." Warren was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I should have paid more attention to what you were doing out here." She looked at the creek. "You helped that morning," she said. "With the baskets? That was what mattered." He nodded. That was all. They stood there in the October light until the sun got low and the air turned cold, and then Mabel turned back toward the house to put supper on. Agnes was sitting on the porch when they came back up the path. She had a blanket over her knees, and she was watching the last of the light on the ridge, with the expression of a woman who has spent her entire life being certain about things and has recently encountered something that doesn't fit. She didn't say anything when Mabel came up the steps. But as Mabel reached for the door, Agnes said, without looking at her, looking still at the ridge, at the fading light, "That stew last week, the one with the roots." Mabel stopped. "Yes?" she said. Agnes was quiet for a long moment. "You could put a little more salt in it next time." Mabel stood in the doorway. "Yes," she said. "I expect I could." She went inside. She stood at the stove and looked at the wall for a moment, and something behind her ribs felt different than it had in a long time. Not quite pride, not quite relief, but something that had their qualities and one other quality she couldn't name. The quality of knowing that you have been exactly where you were supposed to be, doing exactly what you were supposed to be doing, even when no one was watching, even when no one believed you, even on the days when you carried armloads of weeds home in the heat and ate supper in silence while the woman at the other end of the table made her small sounds of dismissal. You could survive a drought if you knew what the land was already growing. Pearl had taught her that, and Pearl had been right, as Pearl generally was, about things that mattered. Outside, the evening settled over the valley. The creek moved on in the dark, and along every fence line and creek bank, in the low ground and the disturbed earth and the shaded places under the pines, the plants that no one had planted and no one had watered and no one had fed were already setting their roots deeper into the soil, getting ready, as they always had, for whatever the next year would bring.